The encounter at the airport. Marcus Hayes adjusted the strap of his sleek leather briefcase as he entered the bustling terminal of Hudson International Airport. He was en route to Chicago, where he was set to argue one of the most high-profile civil rights cases of his career. A black attorney known for his unrelenting commitment to justice, Marcus had faced his share of challenges, but he was not prepared for what awaited him today. The airport was alive with the usual chaos. Announcements echoing through the speakers, passengers rushing past with their suitcases, and families saying hurried goodbyes. Marcus checked his watch. He had an hour and 15 minutes before his flight boarded. Plenty of time, he thought, to get through security and make it to the gate. He approached the security checkpoint, pulling out his laptop, belt, and shoes with practiced efficiency. Marcus moved through the motions quickly, placing his belongings in the gray bins and stepping forward for the body scan. "Sir, please step to the side," came the firm voice of a TSA officer. Marcus turned to see a middle-aged, stocky officer with a badge reading Willis. His demeanor was stiff, his eyes sharp as they assessed Marcus from head to toe. Marcus offered a polite nod and stepped aside, assuming this was routine. "What's the issue?" Marcus asked calmly. Willis folded his arms and gestured to another TSA officer, a younger woman named Tran. "Routine check," he said tersely. "We just need to ask you a few questions." The phrase routine check instantly put Marcus on edge. He had traveled extensively for work and knew what a real routine check looked like. This felt different. The way Willis looked at him, his gaze heavy with unwarranted suspicion, was familiar but no less infuriating. "Of course," Marcus replied, keeping his voice neutral. He glanced at his watch, noting he still had time to make his flight. "What kind of questions?" Willis's eyes narrowed. "Where are you traveling to, and why?" "Chicago. Business," Marcus replied simply. Willis raised an eyebrow. "What kind of business?" Marcus hesitated, not because he had anything to hide, but because he didn't want to reveal too much. "I'm an attorney. I have a case to argue." "An attorney?" Willis repeated with a smirk that Marcus didn't miss. "And what's this case about?" Marcus clenched his jaw. "I'm not sure how that's relevant to airport security." Willis leaned closer, his voice taking on an almost mocking tone. "We decide what's relevant here, sir." The younger officer, Tran, shifted uncomfortably beside him, glancing at Marcus with what seemed like an apologetic look. Marcus noticed her discomfort but stayed focused on Willis. "I've answered your questions," Marcus said, his tone firm. "Am I free to go?" Willis's face hardened. "Not yet. We need to run a few more checks." Marcus exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. "I have a flight to catch. If there's a valid reason to hold me here, I'd like to know what it is." Willis gestured to Tran. "Run his ID again." Tran hesitated for a moment before taking Marcus's ID and stepping away to a nearby kiosk. Marcus could feel his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He checked his watch again. 45 minutes until boarding. The clock was ticking. "This won't take long," Willis said, his tone devoid of any real reassurance. Marcus's eyes met Willis. "I know my rights, and I know what this is." Willis raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Marcus didn't flinch. "It means I know when I'm being profiled." The air between them grew tense. Willis didn't respond, but the faint smirk on his face spoke volumes. Marcus decided not to push further, knowing it would only escalate the situation. He glanced toward Tran, who was still typing into the kiosk, her brow furrowed. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Passengers in the security line glanced over curiously, some whispering to each other as they watched the scene unfold. Marcus felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but he stood tall, refusing to let it show. Finally, Tran returned, handing the ID back to Willis. "Everything checks out," she said softly. Willis glanced at the ID, then back at Marcus. "We'll need to search your bag." Marcus's patience snapped. You've already delayed me for over 20 minutes with no justification. Are you seriously going to waste more time on this?" Willis shrugged, unfazed. "Security protocols, Mr. Hayes. We don't make exceptions." Marcus's hands tightened into fists at his sides. "This isn't about security. This is about you making an assumption based on nothing but my appearance." Willis's smirk returned. "I'd watch your tone, sir." Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "Search the bag," he said curtly. "But know that this isn't over." Willis signaled for another agent to begin the search. Marcus watched silently as they rifled through his belongings, pulling out neatly folded clothes and legal documents. It felt invasive, demeaning, and utterly unnecessary. As the search continued, Marcus glanced at the clock. 30 minutes until boarding. He was cutting it dangerously close. When the agent finally finished, they handed the bag back to Marcus with no findings. Willis stepped forward, his expression unchanged. "You're free to go," he said, as though he were doing Marcus a favor. Marcus's eyes burned with quiet fury as he grabbed his bag. He leaned in slightly, his voice low and steady. "This won't be the last time we speak, Agent Willis." Without waiting for a response, Marcus turned and walked away, his heart pounding with anger and frustration. As he hurried toward his gate, he couldn't shake the thought. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been subjected to this kind of treatment. Unfair, unjust, and unacceptable. By the time Marcus reached the gate, the door to the plane was closed. His heart sank as he watched the aircraft taxiing away. He had missed his flight. But as he stood there, his mind racing, Marcus made a silent vow. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A spark of determination. Marcus Hayes stood at the window of the terminal, his reflection ghosted over the image of the plane carrying his missed opportunity, streaking down the runway. His briefcase hung at his side, its weight suddenly irrelevant compared to the heavy knot of anger and humiliation in his chest. Missing the flight wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a professional disaster. A crucial hearing awaited him in Chicago, where his client, a victim of discrimination in her own workplace, depended on him to deliver the case that could change her life. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a civil rights attorney, fresh from being detained, and humiliated for no valid reason other than what he knew in his heart was racial profiling. As the plane disappeared into the sky, Marcus clenched his jaw. This wasn't going to end here, not for him, and not for others who faced this same injustice. He turned from the window and walked purposefully to a bench near the gate, his mind whirring with ideas. He pulled out his laptop, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he began documenting every detail of what had happened. Timestamps, names, and every word that had been exchanged with the smug Agent Willis and the hesitant Tran. His calm, logical side, nurtured over years of navigating high-stakes legal battles, told him to gather facts, stay focused, and build his case. This was his world, his weapon. And this time, he was both the plaintiff and the advocate. As he worked, his phone buzzed on the bench beside him. Picking it up, Marcus saw his paralegal, Alicia, calling. He hesitated for a second before answering. "Alicia." "Marcus, did you make the flight?" Her voice carried both worry and expectation. "No," he admitted, his tone heavy with frustration. "I was detained at security." "Detained?" Alicia's voice sharpened. "What for?" "For being black, apparently," Marcus replied, his sarcasm thinly veiled. He heard Alicia's sharp intake of breath. "What happened?" She pressed, her voice low but urgent. "You were supposed to be in Chicago hours ago. The judge agreed to put your case first on the docket." "I know," Marcus said, running a hand over his face. "I was held up by TSA, Agent Willis. His name is etched into my mind. Kept me for over an hour with no valid reason. I answered every ridiculous question, let them search my belongings, and still missed the flight." Alicia was quiet for a moment. but Marcus could sense her indignation boiling beneath the surface. "This isn't just about missing the flight, Marcus," she finally said. "This is about power, and they think they've got all of it. You can't let this go." "I won't," Marcus said firmly, the steel in his voice reassuring Alicia and himself. "I've already started documenting everything. I'll file a formal complaint and escalate it from there. I'm not letting Agent Willis hide behind his badge and arrogance." "And the case?" Alicia asked, her tone softening. "We can't lose this one." Marcus glanced at his laptop screen, the cursor blinking at the end of his notes. "Contact the court. Tell them I was unlawfully detained and couldn't make my flight. Request an adjournment. If we have to, I'll find another way to get to Chicago." "You're going to make this right," Alicia said, confidence returning to her voice. "Not just for the case, but for yourself." Marcus hung up, slipping his phone into his pocket as he closed his laptop. Standing, he adjusted his tie and walked toward the airline's customer service counter. He wasn't ready to leave the airport yet, not until he had taken the first steps to ensure what happened to him wouldn't be brushed under the rug. The line at the counter was short, and he quickly found himself speaking with a young woman whose name tag read Leah. She greeted him with a professional but slightly weary smile. "How can I help you today, sir?" "I need to rebook my flight to Chicago," Marcus said, sliding his ticket across the counter. "And I'd also like to report an incident." Leah glanced at the ticket and began typing into her computer. "We'll see what we can do about the rebooking, but could you tell me more about the incident?" Marcus relayed the story, omitting none of the details. Leah's fingers paused over the keyboard as he spoke, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to visible discomfort. "That's awful," she finally said, her voice low. "I'm so sorry that happened to you, sir." Marcus nodded, appreciating her sincerity, but knowing her sympathy wasn't enough. "What I need is accountability. Can you direct me to someone who handles complaints of this nature, preferably someone with authority?" Leah hesitated before picking up the phone and dialing a number. After a brief conversation, she looked up at Marcus. "I've contacted the airport's management team. Someone will meet you here shortly." "Thank you," Marcus said, his tone courteous but firm. He turned to wait, his briefcase resting by his side. As he stood, he noticed a family nearby, two parents with their young children, watching him curiously. The father gave him a small nod, a silent gesture of understanding that made Marcus feel a little less alone. It was a reminder that not everyone in this world was Agent Willis. After a few minutes, a middle-aged woman in a business suit approached, her badge identifying her as Evelyn Thompson, Director of Security. She extended her hand. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Evelyn Thompson. I understand there was an issue at security." Marcus shook her hand firmly. "Issue is one way to put it. I was profiled and detained by one of your agents without probable cause. As a result, I missed my flight." Evelyn's expression hardened, not with defensiveness but with concern. "I'd like to hear everything, Mr. Hayes. Please, let's sit down." The two moved to a nearby seating area, where Marcus recounted the entire ordeal. Evelyn took notes, her pen moving quickly as she asked clarifying questions. "Agent Willis," she repeated, her voice neutral. "And Agent Tran was present as well." "Yes," Marcus confirmed. She didn't seem comfortable with what was happening, but she didn't intervene either. Evelyn nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We take allegations of profiling and misconduct very seriously, Mr. Hayes. I'll initiate an internal investigation immediately." "I appreciate that," Marcus said, his tone measured. "But I'll also be pursuing legal action. This isn't just about me. It's about preventing this from happening to anyone else." Evelyn met his gaze, her professionalism unwavering. "I understand. And I assure you, we'll cooperate fully with any investigation. You'll also receive an expedited report of our findings." As they finished their conversation, Marcus felt a small spark of satisfaction. He had taken the first step, but this was just the beginning. As he watched Evelyn walk away, he pulled out his phone and opened his email. He had allies, colleagues, fellow attorneys, and organizations dedicated to fighting injustice. It was time to call on them. The war wasn't won in a single battle, but Marcus Hayes was ready for the fight. The deeper fight. As Marcus left the seating area where he'd spoken with Evelyn Thompson, the director of airport security, his mind churned with ideas. This wasn't just about his missed flight, or even the personal indignities he'd suffered. This was systemic, a pattern of abuse and unchecked power that needed to be brought to light. He had fought battles like this before in courtrooms, but now it was personal, and he wasn't about to back down. Walking through the terminal, Marcus paused at a quiet cafe. He ordered a coffee, sat down at a corner table, and opened his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he began typing furiously. He wasn't just documenting the details of his experience now. He was preparing a formal letter to his legal team, laying out a plan of action. Dear team, this morning I was detained at the airport by security without any valid cause. I was subjected to invasive questioning, missed my flight, and was ultimately released with no explanation other than routine procedure. This was racial profiling, plain and simple. I intend to take this case public, not just to demand accountability for what happened to me, but to challenge the practices that allow profiling to persist under the guise of security protocols. Here's how I think we should proceed. Formal complaint. File a complaint with the TSA and the airport authority, citing the agents involved, specifically Agent Willis and Agent Tran. Demand an internal investigation and request a written report of their findings. Media engagement. Reach out to media contacts and civil rights organizations. This story needs visibility to highlight the broader issue of profiling in security procedures. Legal action. Prepare a civil rights lawsuit against the airport and the TSA for unlawful detention, racial profiling, and damages related to my missed flight and professional commitments. Policy review. Advocate for a review and overhaul of TSA training and policies, focusing on preventing racial bias. Please let me know your thoughts and availability for a strategy meeting later today. Best, Marcus. Marcus reread the email twice before hitting send. He trusted his team implicitly. They were not only skilled but also deeply committed to the cause of justice. Within moments, his phone pinged with replies. Alicia, his paralegal, responded first. I'm on it. I'll draft the formal complaint and reach out to our media contacts. Let's meet at 3 p.m. Marcus closed his laptop, took a sip of his coffee, and allowed himself a moment to breathe. But even as he tried to relax, a thought nagged at him. Agent Tran. Her discomfort during the incident had been palpable. She wasn't innocent. She hadn't stepped in to stop Willis. But she also didn't seem fully complicit. There was something there, a crack in the wall of the system. He decided to take a chance. Pulling out his phone, he accessed the email Evelyn Thompson had sent him after their meeting. She'd included her contact information and assured him she'd be available for further communication. Marcus quickly typed out a message. Subject: Request for follow-up. Dear Miss Thompson, thank you for meeting with me earlier. As we discussed, the incident with Agent Willis raises serious concerns about racial profiling and misuse of authority. I'd like to formally request a follow-up meeting with both you and Agent Tran. I believe she may have insights into the situation that could help us address the underlying issues. Looking forward to your response. Best, Marcus Hayes. He hit send, unsure if anything would come of it, but he felt it was worth trying. People like Tran often found themselves caught between doing what was right and following orders. If she was willing to speak out, it could strengthen his case and perhaps even push for meaningful change within the system. As Marcus finished his coffee, his phone vibrated again. This time, it was an email from one of his media contacts, Jenna Blake, an investigative journalist he'd worked with before. Her message was succinct. Call me ASAP. This story needs to go live. Marcus smiled grimly. Jenna had a reputation for digging deep and holding those in power accountable. If anyone could shine a spotlight on what had happened, it was her. He stepped outside the cafe and dialed her number. "Marcus," Jenna answered on the first ring, her voice sharp and professional. "I read your email." "Unbelievable. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure if that was entirely true. "But this needs to be more than a personal story. It's part of a larger pattern. And you know it." "Exactly," Jenna said. "I've already started pulling data on racial profiling complaints at airports. It's worse than you think. I'll write a piece, but I need your voice in it. Can you go on record?" "Yes," Marcus said without hesitation. "But I want to do more than talk. I want to push for policy changes. This has to stop." "I'll draft something and send it to you for approval," Jenna said. "And Marcus, don't let this shake you. You're one of the strongest people I know." "Thanks, Jenna," Marcus said, his voice softening. "I'll look for your draft." As he ended the call, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about holding Willis accountable. It was about challenging a system that allowed people like him to wield power without consequence. Later that afternoon, Marcus received a reply from Evelyn Thompson. She had arranged a meeting for the following morning, and to his surprise, Agent Tran had agreed to attend. Marcus was intrigued but cautious. Tran's involvement could either strengthen his case or complicate it, depending on what she was willing to admit. As the sun set, Marcus returned home, exhausted but resolute. He spent the evening preparing for the days ahead, reviewing legal precedents, drafting statements, and strategizing with his team. He knew the fight wouldn't be easy, but he welcomed the challenge. For Marcus Hayes, this wasn't just a battle for his dignity. It was a fight for justice, for every person who had been judged, detained, or humiliated simply for existing. And he wasn't about to lose. Turning the tables. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the airport administration office with a sense of purpose. He had spent the night combing through legal precedents, compiling a list of cases involving racial profiling at security checkpoints, and fine-tuning his strategy. He wasn't just here to address his own experience. He was here to force change. The receptionist, a young man with a nervous demeanor, greeted Marcus with a hesitant smile. "Miss Thompson is expecting you, Mr. Hayes. Please follow me." Marcus nodded, his face calm but resolute. He was led down a series of sterile hallways until they'd reached a glass-walled conference room. Inside, Evelyn Thompson sat at the head of the table, her posture professional but tense. To her left sat Agent Tran, visibly uneasy, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Marcus noted the absence of Agent Willis and raised an eyebrow at Evelyn. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Hayes," Evelyn said, rising to shake his hand. "Agent Tran agreed to speak with us, but Agent Willis declined to attend." "Not surprising," Marcus replied dryly as he took a seat. "Cowards rarely face accountability willingly." Tran flinched at his words, but Evelyn maintained her composure. "Let's get started," she said, gesturing to a folder in front of her. "Mr. Hayes, I reviewed your formal complaint last night, and I must say, the details are deeply troubling. We've opened an internal investigation into the actions of Agent Willis." Marcus leaned forward, his tone measured but firm. "An internal investigation is a start, but let's be clear. This isn't an isolated incident. Agent Willis is a symptom of a much larger problem within this airport's security practices. I'm here to ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." Evelyn nodded, her expression serious. "I understand your concerns, and I'm committed to addressing them. That's why I asked Agent Tran to join us today. She was present during the incident and can provide additional context." Marcus turned his attention to Tran, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Agent Tran, I appreciate you being here. I know speaking out against a colleague can't be easy, but it's necessary if we're going to fix this." Tran swallowed hard, her eyes darting to Evelyn before meeting Marcus's gaze. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry for what happened," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I should have done more to intervene. But Agent Willis is intimidating. He has a lot of influence in our department, and challenging him often leads to retaliation." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Go on," he said. Tran took a deep breath. "When Agent Willis flagged you for additional screening, I didn't see any legitimate reason for it. Your documents were in order, and your behavior was completely normal. But Willis has a history of targeting certain passengers based on his own biases." "Certain passengers," Marcus repeated, his tone sharp. "You mean people who look like me?" Tran hesitated but then nodded. "Yes. He justifies it by claiming he's being thorough, but it's clear to everyone on the team what's really going on. Most of us are too afraid to say anything because he's been with the department for years and has connections in high places." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Tran's admission was damning, but it also reinforced what he already suspected. Willis's actions were part of a broader culture of complicity and fear. "Thank you for your honesty," Marcus said, his voice softening slightly. "But you understand that staying silent only enables this behavior, right? If you and your colleagues don't speak up, people like Willis will continue to abuse their power." Tran looked down at her hands, shame flickering across her face. "I know," she murmured. "That's why I'm here. I want to help, but I don't know how." Evelyn interjected, her tone firm but supportive. "Agent Tran, by coming forward, you've already taken the first step. If you're willing, I'd like you to provide a formal statement for our investigation." Tran nodded slowly. "I'll do it," she said, her voice resolute. "I can't keep turning a blind eye." Marcus felt a glimmer of hope, but knew there was still a long way to go. He turned back to Evelyn. "What's the timeline for your investigation?" "We aim to complete it within 2 weeks," Evelyn replied. "In the meantime, I'll be implementing mandatory bias training for all security staff and reviewing our screening protocols." "That's a start," Marcus said, "but it's not enough. I want to see real consequences for Willis and anyone else engaging in discriminatory practices, and I want a public apology, not just to me, but to every passenger who's been mistreated." Evelyn hesitated, clearly weighing her words. "I can't promise a public apology until the investigation is complete, but I'll ensure your concerns are addressed thoroughly." Marcus frowned but decided not to push the issue, for now. Instead, he shifted his focus back to Tran. "Agent Tran, your courage today matters. I hope you'll continue to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Tran met his gaze, a flicker of determination in her eyes. "I will," she said. As the meeting concluded, Marcus left the conference room with mixed emotions. Tran's testimony was a step in the right direction, but he knew the fight was far from over. He had to keep the pressure on Evelyn and her team, ensure the media stayed engaged, and prepare for the inevitable backlash from Willis and his allies. That afternoon, Marcus met with his legal team in their downtown office. Alicia had drafted the formal complaint, and his lead attorney, Daniel, had already begun outlining the lawsuit. "This is solid," Marcus said, reviewing the documents. "But I want to make sure we're not just focusing on Willis. We need to address the systemic issues at play." Daniel nodded. "Agreed. We'll include a section on the airport's training and oversight, or lack thereof, and push for policy changes as part of the settlement." "And the media?" Marcus asked, turning to Alicia. "I've got Jenna Blake working on an exclusive piece," Alicia replied. "She's pulling data on profiling complaints at airports nationwide. It's going to be a bombshell." Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "Good. Let's keep the momentum going. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been targeted and silenced." As the meeting wrapped up, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no stranger to battles like this. But this one felt different. It was personal, yes, but it was also an opportunity to make lasting change. For Marcus Hayes, justice wasn't just a profession, it was a calling. and he wasn't about to back down. The storm breaks. As Marcus prepared for the next phase of his fight, the storm he had anticipated began to take shape. News outlets, spurred by Alicia's deft handling, picked up the story of Marcus's ordeal, highlighting the broader implications of racial profiling in airport security. The headline in one national paper read, "Civil rights attorney detained without cause. A wake-up call for airport security practices." The story gained traction, and soon, Marcus's name was on the lips of activists, politicians, and everyday citizens alike. The public outcry put intense pressure on the airport administration. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #EndProfilingNow. Videos from passengers who had witnessed the initial incident began to surface, their accounts adding fuel to the fire. One clip showed Agent Willis speaking dismissively to Marcus, his tone dripping with condescension. The clip quickly went viral, further igniting outrage. Evelyn Thompson, the airport administrator, found herself in the hot seat. She had underestimated the extent of Marcus's reach and the depth of public frustration with systemic injustice. At a hastily arranged press conference, Evelyn addressed the growing scandal. "We take these allegations very seriously," she began, her voice steady despite the flashing cameras and murmuring reporters. "An internal investigation is underway, and we are committed to transparency and accountability. This airport is a place where every passenger should feel safe and respected, regardless of their race or background." While her statement was carefully worded, it did little to appease the public. Commentators criticize her for failing to directly condemn Agent Willis's actions, and calls for his immediate suspension grew louder. Meanwhile, Marcus was strategizing his next move. His office had become a hub of activity, with staff members working around the clock to manage media requests, coordinate with advocacy groups, and prepare for legal action. Marcus himself was juggling interviews, meetings, and court appearances, his schedule packed but his resolve unshaken. During a late-night brainstorming session with his legal team, Alicia suggested a bold move. "What if we hold a public forum?" she proposed. "Invite other victims of racial profiling to share their stories. It would keep the spotlight on the issue and show that this isn't just about you." Marcus considered the idea, his mind racing. "It's risky," he said finally, "but it could be powerful. People need to see the human cost of these policies." Daniel nodded in agreement. "We'll need to vet the speakers carefully and ensure the event is well organized. The last thing we want is for it to descend into chaos." Over the next week, the team worked tirelessly to bring the forum to life. They secured a venue, reached out to community leaders, and invited local and national media outlets to attend. Marcus personally contacted several individuals who had reached out to him after his story broke, inviting them to share their experiences. The day of the forum arrived, and the turnout exceeded everyone's expectations. The venue was packed with attendees, their faces a mix of anger, determination, and hope. Cameras lined the back of the room, capturing every moment for live broadcasts and social media streams. Marcus took the stage, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. He looked out at the crowd, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "I stand before you today, not just as a victim of racial profiling, but as a man determined to fight for justice. What happened to me at the airport is not unique. It's part of a larger pattern of discrimination that has gone unchecked for far too long." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Tonight, we're going to hear from people who have experienced this injustice firsthand. Their stories matter, and together, we're going to demand change." The first speaker was an elderly woman named Clara, who recounted how she was detained for hours during a layover because a security agent didn't believe she could afford her ticket. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her resolve was clear. Next came Jamal, a young father who had been separated from his children during a security check, leaving them frightened and alone. "They treated me like a criminal," he said, his voice breaking, "in front of my kids. Story after story painted a damning picture of systemic failure. The crowd grew increasingly impassioned, their voices rising in support after each testimony. By the time Marcus returned to the stage for his closing remarks, the atmosphere was electric. "This isn't just about bad policies or a few bad actors," Marcus said, his voice ringing out across the room. "This is about the soul of our society. Are we going to stand by while people are treated as less than human, or are we going to demand better?" The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the venue. Marcus felt a surge of hope. The momentum was building, and he knew they were on the brink of something transformative. As the forum made headlines, the pressure on Agent Willis reached a breaking point. Faced with mounting evidence and public outrage, Evelyn Thompson had no choice but to suspend him pending the outcome of the investigation. It was a small victory, but Marcus knew the battle was far from over. Behind the scenes, Willis was seething. He viewed himself as a victim of political correctness, his actions misunderstood and exaggerated. Determined to clear his name, he hired a lawyer and began crafting his defense. Marcus, however, was prepared. His legal team had uncovered a pattern of complaints against Willis, many of which had been quietly dismissed or ignored. They compiled these findings into a comprehensive report, which they shared with the media and the airport administration. The report was a bombshell, exposing not only Willis's misconduct, but also the airport's failure to address systemic issues. Evelyn was forced to call another press conference, where she announced sweeping changes to security policies and personnel training. "We cannot undo the harm that has been done," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "But we can, and will do better." As the dust began to settle, Marcus reflected on the journey so far. The fight had taken a toll on him, both personally and professionally, but it had also reaffirmed his commitment to justice. He knew there were more battles to come, but for now, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. That evening, he returned to his office to find a letter waiting for him. It was from Agent Tran, who had testified against Willis despite the risks to her career. Inside was a simple note. "Thank you for standing up when so many of us were afraid. You've inspired me to be braver. I hope we can create a better future together." Marcus smiled, tucking the letter into his desk drawer. The fight wasn't over, but he wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. A new dawn. As the sun rose over the city, casting golden light over its waking streets, Marcus Hayes stood by the window of his modest office. The events of the past weeks had been a whirlwind. Media interviews, public forums, legal filings, and countless meetings with community leaders and advocacy groups. Today, however, felt different. Today was not about fighting for accountability, but about building something new. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Alicia walked in, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "The settlement offer came through," she said, handing him a thick envelope. Marcus opened it carefully, scanning the contents. The airport administration, under mounting pressure, had agreed to a substantial settlement to avoid a drawn-out lawsuit. The sum was impressive, but Marcus's focus was on a specific clause: the commitment to overhaul their security practices and implement mandatory anti-bias training for all staff. "They folded," Alicia said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "Public pressure got to them. They're not just paying. They're committing to change." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a step in the right direction, but it's not the end. This settlement doesn't erase what happened to me or to others who've been profiled and humiliated. It's just the beginning of something bigger." Alicia smiled. "That's why people are rallying behind you, Marcus. You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for all of us." Later that morning, Marcus walked into a packed auditorium at a local university. He had been invited to speak at a symposium on civil rights, and the room was filled with students, community leaders, and activists eager to hear from him. Taking the podium, Marcus scanned the crowd, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and resolute. "I stand here today not as a victim, but as a survivor. What happened to me at the airport was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. But what's more important is what we do about it. He spoke about the settlement and the commitments the airport had made, emphasizing the need for vigilance and accountability. This isn't just about changing policies, he said. It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about creating a world where no one has to endure what I went through. The audience erupted into applause, their energy palpable. As Marcus stepped down from the stage, he was met with a line of people waiting to speak with him. Some wanted to share their own stories of discrimination, while others simply wanted to thank him for his courage. One young man, a college student with tearful eyes, approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice trembling, "you've inspired me. I want to go to law school and fight for justice, just like you." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "The world needs more fighters like you," he said. "Never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. Use your voice, your talent, and your courage to make a difference." As the days turned into weeks, Marcus continued his work, partnering with organizations to address systemic injustice and empower marginalized communities. He launched a foundation dedicated to fighting racial profiling and providing legal support to those who couldn't afford it. One of his first initiatives was a mentorship program for young law students from underrepresented backgrounds. He personally mentored several of them, sharing his experiences and guiding them on their journey to becoming advocates for justice. Among his mentees was Agent Tran, the airport security officer who had testified against Agent Willis. She had resigned from her position after the investigation. Disillusioned with the system but determined to make a difference, Marcus encouraged her to pursue a career in law enforcement reform, helping her secure a scholarship to study criminal justice. Meanwhile, the fallout from the airport scandal continued. Agent Willis, facing overwhelming evidence and public condemnation, was terminated from his position. His attempts to fight back only highlighted his lack of accountability, and he faded into obscurity. The airport administration, under the leadership of Evelyn Thompson, began implementing the promised reforms. New training programs were introduced, focusing on implicit bias and cultural sensitivity. Evelyn herself took a more active role in ensuring transparency, holding regular town hall meetings to address community concerns. Marcus kept a close eye on these developments, occasionally meeting with Evelyn to discuss progress. While their relationship was professional, there was a mutual respect that had grown out of their shared commitment to change. 1 year after the incident, Marcus found himself back at the airport, this time as a guest of honor at a ceremony marking the completion of the first phase of the reform program. The event was attended by government officials, community leaders, and airport staff. Standing at the podium, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him here. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about all of us. It's about recognizing the humanity in each other and standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. And together, we've shown that it's possible." As he stepped down, the audience rose to their feet, their applause a testament to the impact of his efforts. Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the fight for justice was far from over, but that they had made meaningful progress. That evening, as he sat in his office, Marcus received a call from Alicia. "You did it, Marcus," she said, her voice warm with pride. "We did it," he corrected her, a smile spreading across his face. "This was never about me. It was about all of us." As he hung up, Marcus leaned back in his chair, looking out at the city lights. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in a while, he felt a sense of peace. He had turned his pain into purpose, his struggle into strength, and his story into a catalyst for change. And that, he knew, was just the beginning.